Hi everyone, this is Mr. Willis. It is great to see you today. And today we are going to talk about physical and chemical changes. All right, so let's dive right in. All right, so physical and chemical changes are a combination of, we're going to talk about the physical and chemical properties of matter, and also then physical and chemical changes that matter can undergo. Remember that matter is often defined as anything that has mass or takes up space. In other words, it's the stuff of the universe. All right, so so anything that you can touch, anything that you can interact with, is a form of matter. All right, let's see. You can pause the video at any time if you need to add to your notes, and I will also post this. I will also post this PowerPoint online for you to review. All right, so physical property is a characteristic that is observed without changing the substance. Things like the objects, does it have an odor? Does it have a particular hardness or softness? Some metals are very soft and can be dented and compressed with your fingernail, whereas others are quite hard. How much mass does it have? Is it shiny? So all these are different physical properties, just things that can be observed without changing the substance. Now, within the physical properties, there are extensive and intensive properties. Okay, an extensive property is something that depends on how much of it you have. Okay, if I have one little handful of an item, it will have a certain amount of mass. Well, then if I have a dump truck full of that same material, clearly it will have more mass, it will have more volume, all of that would be larger. However, its color will be the same no matter whether I have a handful of it or a dump truck full. Similarly, and this is tricky for a lot of people, its density will be the same, meaning how much of it you have per unit of volume. And you say, but Mr. Willis, wait, if I have a whole dump truck full, that's going to weigh much more than the handful does. That's true, but it will also take up more volume. It takes up the entire dump truck instead of just one little handful. And so even though the mass increases, so does the volume occupied. And so it turns out that the ratio of those two values remains the same, and that is what the density is. So the density remains the same, the melting point and the odor remain the same. And so those are examples of intensive properties. Those are things that do not change as the amount of the material changes, whereas extensive does. All right, a chemical property describes how a substance would react with another substance. Is it flammable? Does it oxidize or rust? Um, does it interact with water to undergo a change of some kind, maybe produce gas? And so any of those are examples of chemical properties. Its flammability, its reactivity, its oxidation, whether it can be oxidized easily or not. All of those are examples of chemical properties of a material. So now we're going to talk about the different kinds of changes that can occur. A physical change is typically a change in a physical property of an item. Not always, not necessarily, because I'll tell you that even though color is considered a physical property of the item, a color change would typically represent a chemical change. So a physical change is when we change some physical characteristic of the material without changing the actual form of the substance. All right. So if I take a piece of paper and tear it, okay, I still have paper. It's just I now have two pieces and they're smaller. If I took a piece of if I took something that was a little bit stretchy, maybe a piece of elastic, and stretched it, that would not actually change its physical properties, that would just change its size a little bit. So those would be two examples of physical changes. Interestingly enough, if I change the object's state, or its phase, meaning solid, liquid, and gas, if I change its phase, that is considered a physical change, because technically you still have the same still have the same material, you still have the same molecular substance. So if I have solid water, which we usually call ice, and I allow that to melt, well, then I just have liquid water. And if I heat that, then it can become gaseous water, which we call steam. And so all of those would still represent, though, H2O, which we commonly call water. All right, so a change in phase is typically an example of a physical change. All right, so let's talk about then some different signs of a physical change. If you see an object melting or transitioning in its in its physical state, if it changes, say, from a dissolved form to a crystal form, oftentimes that is a form of physical change. A change in texture, if I crumple a piece of paper up, or if I smooth something out, then that would be ironing your clothes is a physical change. Or just if I take a paper clip and bend its shape into a different shape, that is a physical change. So any of those can be signs of a physical change. The real thing to consider is, has the fundamental nature of the material changed? Has the fundamental nature of the substance been altered? And if the answer is no, then that was a physical change. So a chemical change is what happens when we do have a fundamental altering of the bonds and of the connections between the molecules. So, and we'll go into more detail about that later on in the course. But if you are fundamentally changing what the substance is, that is, from a raw egg to a cooked egg, you have actually reformed some of the bonds and some of the connections in that egg. And so, yes, it's still egg, but it is not the same in terms of its chemical structure. If I take let's just say if I take a match and light it, it burns and transitions from one form of wood to another. Different bonds break and reform. Oxygen is consumed. Carbon dioxide and water are produced, along with heat, light, and gas, carbon dioxide. So that's all of those are examples of chemical changes. If you burn something, if you digest something, if something ferments and changes, if you cook something, if there is let's go on to the next page and say, if there is a color change, if there is a formation of a precipitate, that is a solid that forms inside a mixture of liquids, if a gas is formed and given off, if there is an odor change, all of a sudden you smell something that you didn't smell before. If there is a temperature change, that is, if the material begins to feel hot or feel cold, that means heat is being given off or taken in. Any of those are signs of a chemical change. Let's take this moment to talk about those temperature changes. If a reaction is giving off heat, that is, you are feeling some heat being produced, then that is an exothermic reaction. Exo, remember, means outside. Therm refers to heat, and so heat is being released to the outside. Endothermic, endo meaning inside, heat is being taken in by the material, which means it will feel cold to the touch. All right, so an exothermic reaction or an endothermic reaction, and those are two examples. All right, that is going to be all that we're going to say about physical and chemical change today. Now we are going to have an opportunity for you to participate in a lab exercise and to identify some different reactions as being physical changes or chemical changes. All right, so I hope you have a wonderful day. Don't forget to like and subscribe.